Mia, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to learn about your story, and we've connected a few times in the past and talked about some of the work you're doing with respect to Fatherly. I've been able to share some work through the Fatherly platform and be a part of the community. So I'm super grateful to not only be a part of that community and also experience the work you're doing, but before we jump into our conversation, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with us what's brought you here and a little bit about the work you're doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, first of all. It's great to be here. And I found that we've always had some really generative and sometimes deep and always interesting conversations. Yeah, I'm excited for what kind of emerges in this conversation. I'm a psychologist, and my interest is really around the prevention of mental health disorders in children and young people. And that's what my PhD research focused on. And then one of the things I noticed during my PhD research was that a lot of children were struggling with the relationship between their mums and dad, or maybe dad wasn't in the scene, or even mum wasn't in the scene. And they were just really struggling. And other children who were not struggling had a much more secure base and had a much more straightforward home life. And and I think this is something, it's not a surprise that we all
Yeah.
know that having a secure base and or having a loving family home set children up for the future better. But I just think there's a lot more that society and we can do to help families and to help children really set their children up for the future. And I definitely think sometimes dads get overlooked, and mums can as well, and especially single
Yeah.
mums. There's a lot of single mums that don't have support. But my focus is really on helping fathers get more support to be great fathers, to be great partners, to be great co-parents, and just to really enjoy life. And at the same time, set their children up for the best sort of possible start. Because I think we all want that for our children. We all want our children and the next generation to do well and to have kind of the best opportunity that they can have.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing all that. I just want to first understand in terms of the research, and I do want to come back to the idea of the support and obviously helping parents build some of those skills that can be helpful. But specifically to the research, what were you seeing as a consequence when children were not having secure attachment bases or those relationships early on with either the mom or dad? What were you seeing as consequences when it pertained to their mental health? And there are a lot of research studies out there that have demonstrated some challenges with behaviors and even growing up and having some of those juvenile delinquency type programs that we hear about. But what were you seeing in the work you were doing?
I think the work I was doing was not looking at sort of direct consequences. And it
Mm.
was much more, there was children or young people who had a number of what we would call risk factors. They had a number of kind of issues in their life or difficulties that made life harder. And they're experiencing poor mental health. And it could be any one of those factors that lead them to have poor mental health, like such as anxiety and depression, or a lot of loneliness or social isolation. But the types of kind of risk factors or problems or issues that some of these young people were facing were things like parents in a sort of custody battle, or dad being absent, or not getting on with a step parent, or disability in the home, in the sense of one of the parents was disabled, like parents living on low income. So then So in the research, we call it cumulative risk. So when there's a certain amount of challenges that a young person has, we know statistically that increases their risk of getting a mental health disorder. So yeah, my interest is really in helping those children have support, have those kind of resilience factors. So then they're set up to overcome any difficulty that they may have. But to your question, there was a piece of research by Dr. Fiona Chalacon and colleagues at King's College, London, published a couple of years ago. And they looked at Finnish mums and dads, so mums and dads from Finland. And they looked at the parents just after birth, and then also 3 months after birth, and then 2 years later. And what they found was dads in the sample, dads in the group of parents that were being studied, the ones who were very stressed just around birth or just after, their children had a much greater chance of having kind of an emotional or behavioral issue at 2 years old. So it made me think, oh, if we could say at the moment when babies are born, we do think about mum's mental health. So mum gets a range of sort of checks, particularly here in the UK, to check that she's doing okay. And often if, say, mum was experiencing depression or some stress or something, that might get picked up by services and she might get some support. But in the UK here, we don't do any checks on how the dad is doing. It made me think, oh, actually, we really need to think, like, how is the dad doing after birth? Like, how is he adapting to this huge transition?
Yeah.
And we can think about that for dad, like for his well-being and mental health. We can think about that for his partner. And also, if you ask new parent, oh, your child is much less likely to have a behavioral or emotional issue at age 2 that you're probably going to have to manage for the rest of that childhood. Would you
Yeah.
prefer to have it or not have it? They'd probably say we'd prefer not to have it. Could we have some support around the birth for dad? And there's a number of things that lead to dads or mums being stressed. So it really made me think that in some ways dads are a bit invisible and we're forgetting about the health and mental health of dad.
Yeah.
And that's a problem in two ways, not just because dads are important, which I do believe. Maybe not everyone believes that, but I do believe
Yeah.
that. But it's also really important for mum, and it's also really important for the child.
Yes.
So I just think everyone can benefit if we take men's mental health, dad's mental health a bit more seriously.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think to your point, both parents matter, but obviously your focus has been more on the father side. And I've spoken to other folks based in the UK, Mark Williams and Scott Mayer, around that the mental health of especially fathers and new fathers. They both have come on this podcast and shared their experiences and how their mental health was affected in the work they're doing. So that kind of leads me into my next question around Fatherli, right? And the work you've been doing there. And you answered my question. I was going to ask you, why did you decide to focus more on the father side of things? And to me, what you're saying is it's often overlooked based on your experience and what you've observed. So then I guess the next question is, what are you doing about it? And do you mind sharing a little bit about the work you've been able to do and the success that you've seen so far?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a tough nut to crack. I think you'll know this as much as me, or even more so, that many men might struggle, but they won't necessarily go to therapy, or they won't necessarily go see a coach, or they won't go and see the doc. We call it the GP here, the local doctor in England, if they are struggling with their mental health. Just men are less likely to go and get help. And I think societal ideas about masculinity, and that being a man means being self-sufficient, and it means being strong and not necessarily
Yeah.
showing emotions, which is seeing so many changes to that narrative. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes. I agree.
Um,
Absolutely.
it's really good, but I don't know if we're necessarily seeing changes in men feeling more comfortable to go and access services. So we set up the Fatherly app with the idea of it being a safe space that men can come and bring their questions or and meet other dads, and also learn about different topics in relation to parenting and well-being. And it was interesting when I first set it up, I wanted, for me, like, well-being is really important. That's my focus as a psychologist. But people were saying, oh, why would dads be interested in well-being? And we have a little questionnaire when people join the app, and probably like 60 to 70% of the dads, they all put well-being as one of their reasons for joining.
Right.
So I think, you know, dads are interested in well-being. It's just a stereotype to think that they might not be. So yeah, and then we also have coaching on the app where dads can access coaches. So the app is free, and then if they can have kind of a free introductory session with a coach, and then if they want to keep going because they're working with a trained professional, then they would pay for those sessions.
Right.
But we've also had, interestingly, mum access coaches via kind of the Fatherly, not so much through the app, but through the website. A few kind of single mums, and I think for single parents, it can be really hard because everything can rest on that one parent. And even if you're in a couple, obviously there are couples where people feel like a single parent because one person is doing so much of the work. But on the other hand, if you need to go out for an hour, you've got that person there, whereas single parents don't always have that support
Right.
in place. And that's another interesting thing about the research as well that I came across when I got interested in this area, which was that single dads, they are more at risk of heart disease, they're more at risk of addiction and alcoholism, they're more at risk of high blood pressure and dying earlier than married dad or dads in school. And I just thought, oh, that's really unfair, actually.
Yeah.
Like, a relationship might not work out, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we want, no one should be suffering. Everyone should have the support they need to be well and to be supported and to be a parent. And being a parent isn't easy. So you do need to get that support, don't you? I think we both know, as parents as well as kind of people working in this space.
For sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I guess you touched on it. For men, it's been traditionally harder to ask for that help or admit that maybe they do need help. Do you feel like that's the reason why you see a lot of those other issues around mental health with men, especially if they're single fathers or they've gone through a relationship that didn't work out? It's that feeling of isolation and not being able to openly put their hand up and be like, you know what, I'm struggling. I need support here, or I need someone to talk to. And that's often that resistance. Maybe it's societal that they've inherited or internalized, or maybe it's just not something they've seen other men do and they don't know where to start or where to even go for that support.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The other thing I've also seen is where, because of a legal battle, a custody battle, or going through a divorce proceeding, that I was speaking to somebody where he was saying he did not want to tell his wife that he was his ex-wife or wife going through the divorce proceeding, that he was experiencing kind of symptoms of depression, because he was very afraid that if he did, then he wouldn't have the same equal chance at 50-50 split of custody of the child. So I think that's also a factor as well, where for some dads, they're having to prove that they're a good parent. So they don't want to risk showing vulnerability. And so in that case, what he did to get through really difficult feelings of hopelessness and despair around his situation was that he really just focused on fitness, and that the kind of endorphins of
Yeah.
going to the gym, and also I think if you get a personal trainer, you start to see kind of results, and it didn't solve his emotional issues, and I don't think it can really, but it gave him some hope. It gave him some more confidence going through that process. And then when he got custody of the child, equal custody, that's when he started to think, okay, well, now I can, now I'm out of the woods, I can also get some support for my mental health. And I do think that is a challenge if people feel like, oh, if I'm honest about my mental health, it's actually going to be used against me. And I think we see that not only in parenting, we see it in organizations as well, where
Yes.
dads might be dads or men struggling with their mental health because they're in a leadership role. They, and there's already some sort of jostling for sort of positions in the company. They don't want to say that
Right.
they're struggling until it's too late, because they don't want it to be used against them. They don't want to lose their job or lose kind of a position that they've worked hard to get. I think it's a tough one to crack, but I
Mm.
think it's in the future, I'm really hoping that we'll have organizations where there will be a safe way to be honest about what's happening with your mental health without feeling, oh, this is going to be used against me now. My manager might take me off this project that I love, or I won't be up for a promotion because people will feel like I won't be able to handle it. All
Yeah.
these kind of tropes about being strong and being this sort of invincible leader, which for some part, they help us with a fast-paced economy and getting work done. But at the same time, if we're getting work done and we're being very productive, but a proportion of people are having to leave because of burnout, because of stress, because of depression, even risk of suicide, then it doesn't, for me, and I might be biased because I'm interested in the health of well-being and of people, but for me, I don't know if that's us moving in the right direction, because I think the healthy organizations are what we want at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Yeah. And healthy fathers are men, right? So you can't have healthy organizations without the health of the individual who are being there. And I do agree with you. I think there is that fear, and rightfully, because often what happens, people are well intentioned too, where if I were to tell coworkers that, hey, I'm struggling with my mental health, they may tiptoe around things. And again, they may be well intentioned around, maybe we don't put a lot of burden on this person or give them a lot of work because they're dealing with stress. And that could be the opposite of what the person needs, right? For example, for me, don't treat me any differently. I just want to make sure you're aware that this is something I'm perhaps working through or dealing with. Let's talk about it rather than everyone acting like there's a big elephant in the room, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that one of the big problems in the world today is that people don't know how to communicate, and they're scared. Like you said, like they'd be scared to say the wrong thing. So let's not talk about the coworker that we think has some kind of issue that we don't fully understand, and let's
Mhm.
make decisions for them without them.
Right.
And I really believe in the mantra, no decision about me without me. And it's part of the whole trauma informed organization to really consider the person in the decisions you make around them. And instead, I think exactly what happened, what you described, which is where people make decisions. It's the elephant in the room. They have sort of secret sidebars and make decisions. And then that person, and if they were struggling with depression anyway or anxiety, imagine how it feels if you know all your co-workers are making decisions about you without even asking you what is your workload or what is your coping style. Are you someone that actually you want to throw yourself more into big projects, or are you someone that you do want to come off certain projects? And I think what happens is in corporate is that often people say, oh, we need to talk about mental health. Let's talk about mental health. Yes, we should really talk about mental health. But they don't end up talking about mental health, right? They say that we will and they raise it as an issue, but then no one goes into the messy detail because of exactly what you said. They're afraid of opening up this, this can of worms that then no one can manage, and everyone will be traumatized and we won't know what to do, and productivity will stop. And
Yeah.
in reality, it's not as scary as that. It might just be a case of Mark talking about going at home and drinking a whole bottle of wine and crying and just not having any support, which is very sad, but it's not going to upset the apple cart. It's something that then people around him, if there's compassion, if there's care, can, those are fixable problems. In theory, not always, but often they are things that can be supported by people within organizations. And often human resources, maybe they don't have everything they need. You probably do need kind of other coaches or external
Yes.
organizations. You do need some people with some mental health literacy, and some human resources departments are really great at that, and then others just don't have that capacity at
Right.
all. The focus is really just on the productivity and the smooth kind of operations of a company. So hopefully that's an area in Fatherli that we're interested in. We've been working a little bit with some utility organizations where men have been spending a lot of time alone because it's just the nature of the job, and they're
Mm.
away from their families. They don't really have other colleagues, and it's just quite demoralizing and it's not good for their well-being. So been looking at ways to put in more support for them so that they can have kind of better life satisfaction, and they're more likely to stay with the company. They're less
Right.
likely to go off with sick days, and there's so many benefits.
Sure.
But it surprises me that people are not more excited about mental health in organizations. But I think it's exactly what you said. I think you put the nail on the head, that it is fear is what holds people back.
Yeah. Yeah. And I did speak at a couple of events, and we did touch on that whole mental health aspect in an organization, and whether or not leaders are doing a good job of creating an environment where employees can feel comfortable talking about mental health. And I think you touched on it briefly. One of the things I did say, the problem there is we're asking maybe too much of the leaders, and they perhaps don't know themselves how to talk about their mental health. So how can they role model that for the employees? And as you said, and as we both know, like even to be a professional in the mental health space, whether you're a therapist or psychologist, there's a lot of skill you have to learn, and then you have to demonstrate the application of those skills. Like I had to do a practicum and work with hundreds of clients to demonstrate that and build those skills and practice them before I could even work as a professional, right? So now you're asking these individuals in an organization to lead these conversations where they don't have those skills or tools. And I think that could be a problem. And perhaps we're asking too much of these people. So, like you said, maybe it requires bringing in people externally who can demonstrate those skills or facilitate those conversations in an organizational level where then the employees are feeling comfortable, or at least they feel like there is an avenue for them to explore their mental health. I know I'm working on a couple of ideas here with a business partner of mine where we're looking at exactly doing that, of providing these services to organizations where the employees can seek it out rather than, again, feeling like they need to disguise it or mask it. And that fear can be debilitating. But I agree with you. I think there is a need for it. And perhaps asking the organization itself to do it is, in my mind, maybe not fair or too demanding.
And I think I completely agree. And I think the other thing is that people sometimes think, organizations think, oh, this is a kind of luxury extra thing.
Yeah.
But it's actually not, because so much of company time is wasted with kind of conflict between manager. It could be a manager with a consultant, or it could be a manager with someone in his team, or it could be two colleagues in their team where they can't work together, or they're driving each other mad, or there's this sort of dynamic where there's this competition between sort of people jockeying for the leadership position, or a leader feeling like a member of their team doesn't respect them or isn't taking the work seriously. And the thing is that all those issues relate to communication and relate to being able to communicate in a healthy way. One of the things that Eric is a coach at Fatherli, and one of the things we've been focused on quite a lot is the framework of non-violent communication. And it's just very simple. It's just a way of talking about your feelings and your observations without blaming someone else. And that those kind of communication skills go across. On the one side, you could say that's part of good mental health and well-being, because you're expressing yourself, you're saying your
Yeah.
needs, you're not attacking other people if there's a problem, which happens in organizations all the time. But the other side, you could say it's actually part of core business, because it's stressful for everyone when there's conflict at work, or when someone gets blamed. It can even be traumatic, whether it's even just an email chain or a series of Slack messages where somebody gets blamed because something wasn't right or wasn't the quality or wasn't ready to go. And that's really common in organizations. And it's an understandable problem, because it's logical. There's a problem, you want to find the source of the problem, you want to fix it. But the way that people find the source of the problem often involves, oh, that's Bob. Bob should have checked with Jenny before this went out, so it's Bob's fault. Let's talk to Bob. But if
Yeah.
Bob's on an email with 50 people, and then we've all identified Bob as the problem, that's actually pretty upsetting for Bob.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I think they're not bad intentioned. It's just like a lack of emotional intelligence to think, okay, how can we surface this? How can we get to the root of this problem in a way that's not bullying, in a way that's not blaming, in a way that we can learn and do better next time? And I think some companies and organizations are where they're really good at that. They're really good at like learning and making mistakes, and you can feel free to make mistakes. And the mistake is like an opportunity for learning, rather than this
Right.
sort of opportunity for persecution and, oh, Bob's got to go. We need to
Yeah.
get Bob out. And
Yeah.
they become really toxic places, and people spend a lot of their waking hours in these big organizations.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to try and create like a healthy organization that doesn't persecute anyone really.
And some of the things you're touching on can extend beyond an organizational setting. Like you touched on single parenting and some of the challenges with that. I think there's aspects of some of the things we've touched on with respect to communication the fear of being vulnerable around your mental health. And you touched on that too with that one father who was afraid of talking about his mental health with his ex-partner because of some of the fear he had around the consequences of it. But those things, the communication piece, we can also apply to co-parenting, right? Parenting after divorce or separation. And I feel like a lot of the times, either it's the legal system that's lacking, and I have my own views on that, but I don't feel like the co-parents are also given the tools or the resources to apply those things. And often their egos may get in the way, or they just don't have the skills to have some of that healthy communication when it pertains to co-parenting. And then that could just be the child could be the one feeling the pressure of that and suffering without anyone really knowing what's going on. And unfortunately, it could be hidden for years and you don't know what the child is internalizing. And sometimes the issues may surface right away, or they may not surface for years if they ever do. There are a lot of things from that aspect around communication and even feeling comfortable to share your challenges with mental health. Is it okay? I think it is, but for the parent to say, you know what, I am struggling with anxiety around my parenting time, or I'm dealing with depression from whatever we've had to deal with. But being openly able to say that without fear of consequences or fear that, oh, is going to impact my parenting now, my parenting time, or the allotment of it, because I may be viewed as someone who's struggling and not capable of parenting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an interesting issue of if you are struggling with your mental health, how much you should share with your child. Because on the one hand, you need to be this sort of strong, supportive face to them. But at the same time, they also need to, and I think we've talked about this before, they need to be able to see that adults experience problems and it hurts their feelings and they have to process it and they have to
Yeah.
figure something out and then they overcome. And like seeing adults overcome things is really healthy for children because they learn the confidence to overcome things for themselves. But then
Yes.
I think it's interesting when a parent is more stuck and say maybe they've been depressed for a week or the anxiety, they can't really get rid of the anxiety. It's become like a sort of just part of who they are. And then it is quite tough for the child because the child also learning and a little bit of anxiety
Yes.
is so healthy and so natural. But if it's a kind of an anxiety that stops you doing things or is
Yes.
actually, a clinical disorder like generalized anxiety disorder, then that's really crippling and it's not great for children. If you have a parent that has an anxiety disorder, obviously it's not, a child can still do really well outcomes wise. Ideally, you have some extra support there for the parent so that it doesn't impact the child too much and then they're not
Yep.
learning the same kind of anxious thinking styles and thought patterns.
Yeah, I think my belief is as an adult, it's your responsibility to figure that out. We're all responsible for seeking the help and figuring it out without burdening our child. But to your point, I think there is that aspect of being able to role model that for your child that, hey, you know what? These are things I'm struggling with, but I'm getting the help I need or I'm working through it. So you're not putting all of that on your child, but you're at the same time showing them that it's okay that these things can happen and you have to be resilient to work through them. And you touched on the whole notion of resilience in children earlier. And I think we're at an interesting time in society, this dichotomy around supporting our children and helping them through. But I find it's a very fine line in terms of balance. How much are you doing? Maybe you don't want to do too much. You also want your child to themselves learn those skills and become resilient. And I think the best way to do that is role modeling it for them, but also letting them figure it out without trying to come in and rescue them all the time. Otherwise, they won't have those skills when they have to be adults themselves.
I completely agree. And he touched on this idea that all adults should be responsible, all parents should be responsible. And it reminded me of a coaching client who he really struggled with responsibility as a man. So he was divorced. He had 3 children from his previous marriage, and he had the children half the time. And then he also had a new girlfriend, and he was starting a new business and was really into fitness and a range of different things. And sometimes he really struggled when there was sort of pressure from his new partner plus pressure from the old partner, the previous partner around parenting. And his coping mechanism was just to run away in a way, to bury his head in the sand. And I think sometimes like men get stereotyped as doing that maybe more than women, but I think women do it as well, but just in different ways. And I thought it was really interesting because sometimes what's happening is his sort of inner child is just feeling overwhelmed and is so afraid of letting people down and not fulfilling the responsibilities that he then doesn't fulfill anyone's responsibilities because he's running away. And then, and one thing that can really help with that is that awareness of actually how much can I cope with and how comfortable do I feel and how safe am I to say to others in my system when I feel overwhelmed and when I feel I can't actually do everything that's being asked of me. And I think that's really part of kind of modern life, for whether you're a parent or not. Everyone's trying to be healthy, eat healthy, be fit and well, have a social life, be a good daughter or son or uncle or brother, be be a good father or mother, be a good partner, and do a job
Yeah.
and fix a garage or whatever it is. And there's just, or sort the car out. There's just, I was sort the holidays. There's like a huge number of things that's part of being a modern human, and it can be very overwhelming to try and do everything well. And naturally, I think some of the advice I sometimes give people is some things have to go. You have to prioritize what you
Well,
can actually do in this time. And then if you pride yourself on being like an amazing chef that cooks incredible meals for your family every day, but then you also want to achieve this at work and this in your free time and this as a parent, you might not be able to do all those things. Like one thing has to give. And it's really important I think sometimes we have a little bit of a perfectionist culture where we see incredible things around us all the time and we want to be performing at that kind of high level. But actually, we all have limits. There's only so many hours in a day. We only have so much energy. And I think that's where like self-compassion comes in, and the idea of like good enough parent. You don't need to be a perfect parent. You need to be a good enough parent. And maybe we need those kind of ideas as well, like in terms of being like a wife, a husband, a girlfriend, a boyfriend. Like actually sometimes we just need to be a good enough and emotionally supportive partner. We don't need to be perfect. Or if we're choosing to be single, we just need to be good enough for ourselves. Like we don't need to be winning marathons every weekend. It's about what keeping you well and happy. And yeah, I think it's an interesting time, isn't it? Because I feel like there's a reevaluation a little bit of what it means to live like a modern life. You
yeah.
know, I think like the last few years coming out of the pandemic, everyone's been like slamming themselves into work and business, understandably, because the economy's been so tough. But now I think maybe we're reaching a bit of a reflection point where people are thinking, actually, how do I want to live? Who do I want to be in the world? What's meaningful for me? And it's not necessarily about making the most money, or it might be about being healthy and sorting out like health issues so that you're just
Yeah,
wake up healthy and energized every day
yeah,
rather than being, or you're doing your passion or you're helping your child with their passion. I think it seems to me that at this time people are reconsidering what a good life kind of looks like. I don't know. Have you noticed that, or what do you feel?
yeah. No, I definitely agree with you. There's a lot of things that have come to the surface post pandemic, and there's many reasons behind that. From my perspective, I think a lot of people, I feel like people went in two different directions coming out of the pandemic for the most part, where either they realized some of the challenges or issues they had and that were perhaps tucked away or buried beneath the surface, and they started coming out because you had to sit at home in isolation and you couldn't really run away from some of those problems or escape them. So you had to face them. Or people then realized that there is a different way of living life and you don't have to be in this chase or the perfectionism that you touched on, right? So I think you're seeing both sides of it. And for the people that where the issues started to erupt, it caught them by surprise because they actually it was maybe the first time they came to their conscious awareness. So that's what I've noticed. And around that perfectionism, I think perfectionism, we all tend to use it to disguise the shame. And shame is so prevalent in society. Social media hasn't helped. And there's shame coming from divorce too, right? A lot of people experience that shame. So they tend to mask it with perfectionism or overworking themselves. And with social media or the world we live in today, there is that aspect of comparison too, which also leads to shame. And as fathers, you can easily fall prey to that, right? I've heard some men who are struggling being single dads or even trying to occupy their children at times. And they'll say, I heard this guru dad on a podcast say that I shouldn't be playing video games with my child. And I'm like, yeah, I can understand the intention and the meaning behind that, but you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? If that's what you need to do in the moment to function and cope or bond with your child, do it. But that shouldn't be the substitution for parenting. So there's a lot of people out there who are preaching a perfectionist lifestyle too. And a lot of men are falling into that comparison trap that in order to be a great dad, I have to look a certain way physically. I have to be in this like physique or maintain this physique, be in shape. Then I have to have all these skills around communication. I need to have this perfect marriage with my wife or my partner. And then I have to be like this amazing dad that who's always keeping my children occupied and making sure they're doing healthy things. That is an idealized state. And anytime we fall short of that, we tend to internalize it as shame again. I think everyone's struggling with that. And even these dads who are preaching it, I wonder how much of their own shame is coming up for them and they're trying to disguise it in,
Yeah, I
some
love that
shape or
you
form.
mentioned shame actually, because I think it's such a powerful driver and a lot of online behavior as well. It's a lot of covering up shame and
Yeah.
even talking about people are ashamed to talk about shame, and it linked with stigma, and it's linked to so many things. And yeah, I really hope that on Fatherly we have a space where people can be free of shame. And we do get people really pouring their heart out sometimes, and that is what it's for. So it is great when people can be really honest about what's going on for them. And quite a few, for a while, we had a lot of dads talking about how they felt just really left out when their baby was born because the mom and the baby were so close. And then suddenly it feels like they've suddenly lost that close relationship with their partner. And then their baby doesn't seem, just wants to nurse and doesn't seem interested in them. And then that's quite difficult because, like you said, if you want to have that kind of, everyone puts pressure that it's this perfect period. I think there was a famous actor recently. He was talking about how he just didn't really bond with his baby
Yep.
for the first 3 months. And that's really common. And I think just being able to say, "Oh," the good thing is it usually comes, and particularly when the baby starts playing more and more interactive and talks more and can play, and then dads, dads, they absolutely, a lot of babies absolutely thrive with dad, and they need that play. It's so good for their development. And dad can be just as connected to babies. So it's a bit like why some babies sleep so well and then others are just awake all the time. And similarly, like other babies completely disinterested in dad and others are just bonded to dad from day one
Right.
as mom. And I think there's so much diversity, and you're right. People see one version of something and think that the only way to be. And it's quite painful if you don't fit into that box. Um,
Yeah.
and so I don't know how we do it, but somehow we really need to emphasize this kind of plurality, and so many different types of experiences matter and happen just naturally. It's just part of the world we live in, just like different types of flowers in a garden. There's so many different plants and shrubs, and we're all different. Rather than assuming that we're all going to be like a cactus or like an orchid or something, we all need different conditions to survive and to thrive. And yeah, somehow we need to get that message because those shameful feelings can make people feel really depressed and really despairing because they get stuck, don't they? Rather than people realizing, oh, it's an emotion and I can pass through and I can get to the other side of it, they get stuck. And we were talking this week actually on Fatherli about emotional interruption, which is this process where you start to have an emotion, but because as a child you were not allowed to feel that emotion, you actually stop yourself and then it comes out like a cough, or you hurt your shoulder and the emotion trapped in your body rather than
Yeah.
being able to go through it and process it. So yeah, so I'm happy that we're both in this space doing this work because I do think it's very much needed.
Yeah, yeah, and that shame spiral can be very debilitating, as you touched on, and yeah, and I see it with a lot of men, and a lot of the times it does manifest in addiction, unfortunately, and then that struggle continues because they've never had that opportunity to express themselves. So that is another huge problem that I'm seeing, at least on in the work I'm doing here. But coming back to Fatherly, I think you guys have done an amazing job and been recognized. Do you mind sharing some of the value in terms of Fatherly been delivering and the recognition you guys have received as well
Yeah,
there?
yeah, absolutely. So we've been nominated for about 6 awards, and we won 3 awards, which was great. And yeah, the value is really like a safe space for people to talk about what's going on for them and get evidence, science-backed information on a range of parenting topics. We we originally built Fatherly for single dads, and then we
Yeah.
found that a lot of kind of new dads were using it. So we added more content in relation to being a new dad. And then recently, we've actually had a lot of young dads join the app as well. Dads 17, 18, 19 years old. So I'm quite excited about that because that it's just organic and it can be, I keep trying to put this sort of message across that as well as it's really hard if you're a young dad because you don't have the life experience and it's really scary around finances and it's just a huge responsibility. But at the same time, I- I'm 42, and if I was a parent, if I became a new parent now, I'd probably have half as much energy as a 17 or 18 or 19-year-old. They have energy and actually when I first became a parent, I was late 20s and I was much younger than a lot of my other parent friends. And I was the one that would be running around with the kids all the time, not because I didn't want to, I loved it. And I think the younger you are, the younger and fitter you are, the more you can run around and climb trees and kids absolutely love it. Obviously, you let them do their own thing as well. But having the energy and being closer to the mindset of being a child when actually everything is new and confusing and you're unsure of so many things, I think was really helpful because I think the older we get, the more we're used to things and we're used to having to know all the answers for things. And that's really boring to a kid. Like a kid doesn't always want you to know all the answers. They want you to be in the state of wonder and excitement with them. So, so there's definitely lots of positive that young dad can bring to it as well as,
Absolutely.
yeah, as well as this. I can imagine also being terrifying. So I
Yeah.
do have empathy for them as well.
Yeah, and what I like about Fatherly, it's a global community, right? So there's no barriers there, and you can be a part of it, and like you said, connect with other men. And I think that's the biggest thing I've noticed. I know you were asking me earlier about the pandemic too. I think another thing that I came to realize coming out of it is we've lost our sense of community. We're so disconnected from each other, and I think for me, that's what the pandemic brought to the surface was, yes, even though before it, we weren't in social isolation, we were still disconnected. We were going to work, just living in this, I would say, almost autopilot way of life. And you're just going from task to task, but you're not really connecting with people. And I realized that when I was able to, and the podcast has really helped me recognize that too, where I'm able to, even though a lot of the conversations are remote, I'm able to connect with people and have a conversation where I'm present. And we're talking about meaningful stuff as opposed to the past for me, where it was very superficial and surface level. And some of the men's groups I've been a part of have demonstrated that too, that sense of community and connection can go a long way for everyone involved as far as their mental health is concerned. Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of us struggle with the mental health and our ability to talk about it because it feels so lonely and we feel like we're isolated and we have to do it alone. And what I try to remind everyone is we don't have to do it alone. There is someone out there who's either experienced something you have or is going through something similar, or you can learn from their experience and talk about it. And that sense of connection can go a long way.
Yeah, definitely. And we had someone the other day who just said, really struggling with co-parenting. What should I do? And then another dad who'd been co-parenting for a long time gave them some advice. And I find it really heartwarming. There's a lot of problems in the world, but there's some really good people on the Fatherly app. There's some good, like yourself, there's good dads who want to help other dads and they may, there's some people who are really struggling and then, but there's also people who are not struggling or have got through things, gone through struggles and got to the other side. And I find it very heartwarming seeing like how like amazing some people are and how they, like a lot of people just want the best for their family and for their children and for their partner. And for me, it's always like a reminder of how good people can be. I think sometimes you watch the news and you think, wow, there's like war and there's like homicide and there's all this like harrowing things. And then I find a lot of the sort of good things that people are doing on the Fatherly app is really a reminder of like positive masculinity and the positive things that men and fathers can do as well, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's amazing. And Thank you, Mia, again for coming on here and having this conversation with me. I truly appreciate it. And I'm really grateful for the connection we built and some of the opportunities you've brought to me to be able to share my voice. So I really appreciate that. And I'm extremely grateful for the work you've done. It's amazing that you've created this space for fathers, and I think it's much needed. So thank you for all that. And I guess in terms of if you wanted to share with the listeners, what are some ways if they wanted to talk to you or get a hold of you or become part of the fatherly community, what are some ways they can do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me on this podcast. It's really wonderful. And yes, so they can download the Fatherly app from the App Store or Google Play. They can also add me on social media if they want to. Mia underscore psychology and wellbeing. Absolutely. Yeah. And happy to reach out to me if they want to chat about kind of anything related to fatherhood or mental health, or would like some kind of coaching session, or would like to be connected to one of the coaches or therapists in our cadre of people. Yeah, and absolutely. I'm always open to collaborations and connecting because I think, like we were saying at the beginning, it's still a new emerging space, like giving more focus and support to dad. So I'm really keen to push that agenda for dads generally because I think everyone serves to benefit. Yeah, and it's quite a sort of exciting time, I think, in there's a lot of scope for things to be very different, for things to be a lot more egalitarian and dad to be just put more in the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. Thank you again.
Pleasure. Thank you.